In this module, we're going to look at various techniques for footprinting networks and performing reconnaissance. We'll examine various tools and techniques for footprinting domains, subdomains, email addresses, DNS information, and networks. We'll also look at how to leverage social engineering and talk about footprinting prevention. Before we jump into some footprinting tools and examples, let's discuss what footprinting is and the different types of footprinting that we may employ. In the 5 phases of hacking, we introduced phase 1 as reconnaissance, and that's the phase where footprinting falls. Footprinting is essentially reconnaissance, where we're trying to collect as much information about a target as possible. We already talked about active versus passive reconnaissance, and that applies here to footprinting. Passive footprinting means we are not directly interacting with a target. Some of the things we may be trying to discover through passive footprinting techniques include domains and subdomains, employee discovery through social media platforms, the operating systems and software in use, and more. Active footprinting means that we are directly interacting with a target. When we're using active footprinting, we do need to use more care with this because we can potentially set off alerts by interacting with that target, such as an intrusion prevention system alert. Now, you may be wondering why we're trying to avoid that. After all, we have permission to test, so why does that matter? Well, it matters because we are, of course, trying to think and act like an actual malicious threat to the target. Some actions taken here with active footprinting can include performing ping sweeps and trace routes on the network, attempting to discover DNS information, gathering valid internal email lists, and searching for available file shares on the network, among other things. It's probably obvious why this is important for an attacker to perform, but why is this important to ethical hacking? And there are several upsides to this. First, it allows us to create a logical representation of the network, what we commonly call a network diagram. If we're able to discover IP address ranges, domains and subdomains, hosts, and other network devices that may be on the network, such as switches and routers and firewalls, then we can begin to create a topology map of how the entire network is interconnected. This allows us to discover the various vectors or directions from which the target could potentially be attacked. Once we understand the network topology, we can begin to narrow down our assessment. There may be hosts or devices on the network that are deemed to be unimportant to us because maybe there's no advantage to gaining access to those in regard to gaining control or performing malicious actions. So we don't necessarily want to waste time performing assessments against those types of devices. Once we narrow down our scope to places where we're likely to have success, we can focus on deeper intelligence gathering against a smaller subset, perhaps looking for software or operating system versions that have known vulnerabilities. Once we do that, our footprinting techniques allow us to spend time tailoring attacks specifically towards the areas that we think will have a higher potential for success, rather than playing a guessing game and spending lots of time with trial and error. And also, as I mentioned, with setting off any sort of intrusion alarms, this will help us to discover the current security posture of the target. If we're able to easily evade detection through our assessments, then it's likely that better safeguards need to be employed as a remediation step. Now that we understand footprinting a bit better, let's look at some specific techniques for performing footprinting against a target. We all know that Google is the king of search engines, handling over 92% of the searches performed on the public internet. Google has such a powerful ability to crawl and catalog the internet that it goes without saying what a powerful tool for footprinting that this search engine is. They index almost everything within a website, including, in some cases, sensitive data. There are, of course, ways to block Google from indexing this data, but of course, not everyone is aware of this or implements these procedures correctly. We're going to explore leveraging the internet in this video, starting with Google. We're going to look at something called Google dorking. Dorking is the name used for leveraging Google to uncover open source intelligence through the Google search engine function. So if you see or hear the term Google dorking, this essentially means Google hacking. The resource I want to point you to here first is the exploit database found at exploit-db.com. When you reach the home page, if we look in the upper right menu here, we'll see an informational box where we can look at the About Exploit-DB. And when we do that, you'll notice that this is maintained by a company called Offensive Security. If that sounds familiar, it's likely because you're familiar with Kali Linux. The same founder and core developer responsible for Kali Linux is the CEO of Offensive Security, a great company dedicated to providing resources for penetration testing and ethical hacking. If we close this out and we actually go over to the left-hand menu and we hover over that, the second option that we see, the second from the top, is GHDB, something called the Google Hacking Database. And when we load that, you'll see we have presented to us a collection of Google search terms that are known to return sensitive data attached to websites. These are websites which have been crawled and collected by Google search engines. Now, before we dive into this database, let's first talk about some of the advanced Google search operators that we can use. Now, people often ask me, what skills do I need to be a successful network engineer or a successful help desk associate? What's the most important certification for me to have? And I can tell you from many years of experience in the field and in the workplace, one of the most important skills you can have is the skill to be able to use Google. Now, that might sound crazy, but it's absolutely true. What separates many from the pack in regard to learning and discovering information and being able to answer their own questions is their ability to use a search engine effectively. You don't have to have a master's in computer science by any stretch of the imagination, but being able to perform good, targeted searches is going to take you a long, long way, especially in regard to footprinting. I want to point you to this Google support forum for refining web searches. If you perform a search for advanced Google operators, you'll find one of the first hits in the search list is going to be this Google support document, which shows you how to refine your web searches. Now, we aren't going to go through this entire document, of course, because that could encompass an entire course in itself, but this is really, really powerful when you're performing web searches. This is going to help us out tremendously. There are also many other blogs and external websites outside of this article that explain the syntax around this, so I would definitely recommend taking some time to read through and understand that, and we'll cover a couple of examples of that here. Let's jump over to a browser window with Google loaded in it, and let's do a search for Indeed.com as an example. If we scroll down, we're going to see Twitter results, we're going to see LinkedIn results, and lots more listed here. We'll look at other specific ways to perform subdomain searches later in this course, but we can also search for subdomains through Google. If we preface our search at the beginning of the search string, if we say site:"Indeed.com and we hit enter, we're going to get more results specifically for any site containing Indeed.com in the domain. We can start to narrow these down as we like. We see the main one at Indeed.com, of course. We also see es.indeed.com. We see gr.indeed.com. So at the end of our search string, we could say subtract es. And if we do that, notice that our top search result is now gone because we removed that. We could also say minus gr as well, and we can continue to refine our search results. We could even say minus www and continue to get a list of subdomains. Another thing we can search for are file types. So we can say site:"Indeed.com, and we can also say file type: and let's say something like CSV. CSV standing for comma separated values. Of course, there are no hits, not surprising with this very well-known website, but if we did get a hit, that could be a jackpot. It could be an exported database of some sort, perhaps usernames and passwords, or maybe an email address list. We could also search for other types of files if we wanted to do a doc, a doc file, which is a Microsoft Word file. We could do PDF, and we could continue to try to dig for deeper information. So those are just a few examples of the optional search operators that we can use. And again, that list is quite extensive. If we jump back over to our Google hacking database, and if we start to look through the listings for our Google Dorks, we're going to see many of these listed in here. Now, I've also included a search operator cheat sheet that you can reference with some of the most common, basic, and advanced operators, so feel free to try some of those out for yourself. If we click on our orange filters button here at the top right, let's do that. And under the category drop down, if we pull that down, we're going to see all the different categories under which these have been sorted here in the Google hacking database. So if we click on, let's say, files containing usernames, this is going to bring up a list of results of advanced Google operators, such as in title. We see in title, colon, in text, colon. If we take this second one, in title, colon, index of contacts.txt, basically what this is saying is this is only going to search in web page titles for the specific phrase that's in parentheses. In this case, index of, and it's going to look for contacts.txt. In other words, it's looking for a plain text file that might be named contacts, which could potentially give us results for plain text files indexed on a website containing usernames. Obviously, there's been some success with this in the past, hence the reason that it is listed here in the Google hacking database. Now, we can also combine some of these operators with what we previously looked at. So in a search engine, maybe we begin our search string with site, colon, followed by a website name that we looked at earlier. And then we can copy this exact Google dork and paste it at the end. And that's going to allow us to search against a specific website instead of searching the entire internet for this. Now, if we go back to the main database page, you're going to see that this is a very, very extensive database. In fact, here at the bottom, we see that there are over 6,600 entries listed inside of this database. So it's definitely a resource you can use for footprinting. There are many other great search tools available in addition to Google, so I do want to mention a few of those here as well. The first one I'll point out is zoomeye.org. If we take a look here at ZoomEye, we'll see under the search bar we have a search helper. So if we click on that, this is going to give us information about how to use the logic operators on this website. So for example, if we're looking for information about a specific website or a specific host name, we see that we use hostname colon followed by the actual domain that we want to search against. So this is another option that we have just for some deeper intelligence. We also have services like Shodan search engine. That's a paid service that's going to look for internet connected devices, and also Census, another paid tool that looks for devices and open ports. Similarly, we have websites such as thingful.net. That's going to search for IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. This would include things like Apple Watches, smart bulbs, doorbell cameras, voice controllers like Amazon Echo, and many more things. So that's a look at a few ways we can leverage the internet. Certainly not a comprehensive list. There are tons of great tools out there, but this is a great list of resources to get you started. Let's talk here about domain and subdomain footprinting. And I want to start out just in our terminal and show you one of the most basic ways that we can gather information about a particular domain, and that's with a simple ping command. So I'm going to say ping, and I'm going to use eccouncil.org. That is the organization that provides the ethical hacker certification. And if we ping that domain, one of the main things you'll see returned to us is the actual IP address that's associated with this domain. So you can see that listed here. So that's some fairly basic information that we can gather about this particular domain. And I'll point you to several website tools for that as well. Let's first go out to my browser, and you'll see that I already have eccouncil.org popped in here. This is the census.io website, and they do have a domain search tool. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter for eccouncil.org and perform a search on that. And you'll see that we have some search results come up. We'll click on that, and we have some basic information about this domain. We see things like the fact that this is using Cloudflare. We see that they have HTTP and HTTPS listed here. We see information about a handshake. We see the certificate chain. Lots of information that we can gather about this particular domain. Likewise, I'll point you to a site called sitereport.netcraft.com. We can do a similar action here with eccouncil.org. We'll click look up. You'll see that it takes just a bit of time to analyze the site. And of course, we see more information about that. We see even DNS information, such as the name server listed here. Again, we see Cloudflare, we see their IPv4 address, even the IPv6 address. We see some IPv4 address ranges that they have. So again, lots of helpful information here. When we're performing footprinting against a domain, some of the things we're looking for are subdomains. Subdomains are attached to the main domain, but they may give us a different vector, a different entry point into a domain. So those are very helpful to know. Another resource is pentest-tools.com. And again, I'm going to search against eccouncil.org. I'm going to click free scan. While that's scanning, I will mention that some of these tools are limited if you're on a free version. I'm showing you all the free versions here, but you can certainly upgrade and pay for some of these tools, and you're going to get more thorough results. You're going to get more in-depth abilities to analyze these domains. So again, lots of similar information that we've seen in other online tools. We see that this is using Cloudflare. We see they are on the WordPress 5.5.1 platform, and we're beginning to see some of these subdomains as well. We see store.eccouncil.org, blog.eccouncil.org. We see some information about their mail server, autodiscover.eccouncil.org. We see the sites are built with PHP. So again, we're trying to gather information. We're in the reconnaissance phase, the intelligence gathering phase. So that's exactly what we're doing here. And so far, we really haven't performed anything super technical. We haven't used anything that you can't find online as a website resource. So I wanted to give you an idea about some of the website tools that are available out there that will very quickly and easily give you some information about that. Now let's begin to look a little more in depth. And the first thing that I'll point you to, let me jump back into my Parrot OS, and I'm just going to clear off the terminal here. And let's look at some tools that are actually built into this. Now these tools are found in both Parrot OS and Kali Linux, two of the most popular platforms for ethical hackers and penetration testers. The first tool let's look at is called the Harvester. This is a Python-based utility, and we can use this utility to obtain information from various public outlets. That information could be public databases, it could be subdomains, employee names, port numbers, email addresses, and so on. We're going to look at this from the perspective of domains in this case, but again, it's a very thorough tool that you can use for lots of things. If you want to determine what someone who is outside of your company or your network has the ability to see that's on the inside of the network in regard to open source intelligence, this is super useful for that. So let's run this. And to do that, in our terminal, the command is the Harvester with a capital H. You want to note that capital H. And in fact, let me run it with a lowercase h first, just to show you what that looks like. And if we do that, it tells us this old command is deprecated. Please use the Harvester with a capital H instead. So let's do that. I'm going to hit enter, and you'll see that this loads up for us. Now, in older versions, once we ran that command, we were displayed a help message that had explanations with usage examples. In this newer version, it's a much more abbreviated output. We see the usage listed here, but we can arrow up and say the harvester -- help to see that full help file. And this is going to explain all of the arguments that we have available. If we scroll up, you'll see the optional arguments that we can use. And a few of these arguments that I'm going to use this -D argument, which is going to let me specify the domain that I want to scan against. I'm going to use this -L argument followed by a number, and that's going to set a limit. We're going to be able to limit the number of searches that we do. And why would we do that? Well, again, that's a way that we might want to perform a faster scan against that rather than having to wait a long time on a lot of results. So I'm going to do that in this particular lab just to speed things along. I'm also going to use the -B argument that we see here, which is source. That's going to let us choose a source for searching. So let me show you what this looks like. So I'm going to say the harvester, and I'm going to first say -D to specify my domain, and I'm going to set that to eccouncil.org as we have been looking at before. I'm going to say -L to limit the number of searches just to speed things along. In my case, I'll set that to 250, and I'm going to say -B to set the source. By the way, the sources that we can use, you can see listed in our help output here. We can search through things like Bing, we can use Census that we looked at in our web browser earlier. We see LinkedIn. We even see Google on here. So I'm just going to say Google to set that as my source. I'm going to hit enter, and we'll let this work for just a bit. And after just a few seconds, we do see our results here. You can see that we have found 10 hosts listed here in our output with the host names followed by the IP addresses. So these are actually subdomains of the original eccouncil.org domain. We see things like aspen.eccouncil.org. So already we have more information than we started with. And again, we only performed 250 searches. We only also used Google. Now we could perform this with a higher number of searches. We could use multiple sources, and that would certainly give us more thorough information. Another passive tool that we can use for intelligence gathering inside of Parrot OS is something called Recon-ng. So let me clear off our terminal, and I'm going to say Recon-ng in the terminal. That's going to load this tool up for us. So we see our welcome message here. Now, if you see a message saying no modules enabled or installed, as we do see here listed, I'll show you how we can fix that. That means we need to actually install the Recon-ng modules. Depending on the version that you're running of Kali Linux or Parrot OS, you may have to do that. You may not have those installed. So we may have to say marketplace refresh. We'll hit enter to refresh that. And then we're going to actually install all of those modules. We'll say marketplace install all and hit enter. And after just a few moments, it's going to install all of our modules. It's very likely that this will be the case for you, so I did want to use a fresh version of Recon-ng just to show you how to get up and going with those modules. I'm going to pause the video here and let these modules complete the installation process, and then we'll jump back in and take a look at Recon-ng. Okay, now all of our modules are installed, we're all completed, and we see those available here when we run the recon-ng command. So again, even though you have Recon-ng installed in your version of Kali Linux or Parrot OS, most likely, you probably don't have the modules, so I wanted to show you how to get those. There are many modules built in here, but I do want to demonstrate one of those called Hacker Target. This is going to help us gather subdomains from our main target. So to run that, I can say modules, load, Hacker Target, and I'm going to hit enter. Now I can say options set source, and I'm going to set that to eccouncil.org and hit enter. Now you can see if I say info, you'll see that our source is set to eccouncil.org. So that looks good. Now if I enter the command run, this is going to execute the module against the domain that we've indicated. In my case, eccouncil.org. And once that's completed, if we say show hosts and hit enter, you'll see a summary of the subdomains and the resources that we've discovered, including the host name and IP address. Again, we see several subdomains here, such as iclass.eccouncil.org, store.eccouncil.org. So again, great information that we can have as we're enumerating this main domain and discovering subdomains. One more tool I'll point you to is called Sublister. This is a tool designed in Python, and it uses open source intelligence in order to enumerate subdomains. It's very useful for pen testers to collect and gather subdomains for their targets. This uses a combination of many search engines like Google and Yahoo, and even online tools like VirusTotal. So here I am at the GitHub page for Sublister, and if we scroll down, we see the About section for that. We see some screenshots, but I want to point you to this installation command. We see that here, git clone, followed by the HTTPS address where we can clone this GitHub directory. Once we do that, once you run that inside your own terminal, inside of Parrot OS or Kali Linux, then you're going to want to change into the Sublister directory, and you're going to want to run this installation to install all of the dependencies that we need in order to run that. Now, to save time, I've already gone ahead and done that. So back in my Parrot OS box, let me clear out our terminal. Now in my terminal, let's perform a list command, and you'll notice I have a Sublister directory listed here. So let's change into that. We'll say cd Sublister. Also notice this is spelled with a 3 instead of an E. That's how the tool is spelled, so you want to make sure that's the case or it won't work. Now we'll do another ls inside of this directory, and notice inside of this directory we see sublister.py. py means that's a Python file, so this is our Python tool. In order to run that, we want to say /sublister.py, and when I hit enter, you'll see this Python tool loads. It tells us that we need an optional argument, so we need to actually specify the domain that we want to scan against. So I'm going to up arrow, I'm going to say -d, and I want to use eccouncil.org once again, and I'm going to hit enter. And as I said, you'll see this is enumerating subdomains. It's performing searches in multiple search engines. And once that completes, we can scroll up and see this list of all our subdomains that were found using this tool. Another way we can use that is we can also enumerate any subdomains with a specific port open. Let's say we want to search for subdomains of eccouncil.org that have port 80 open, which is regular HTTP. To do that, we would say -p to indicate the port number, and we'll say port 80. We can also continue to narrow this down by choosing specific search engines. We could say -e and use Google and hit enter. So now we're enumerating subdomains, only searching in Google, and it's only going to look for subdomains that have port 80 available. And once that completes, we don't have an output here, so it doesn't appear that they're using any domains with port 80. Let's try port 443, which is HTTPS. Again, we're only searching with Google. So you can begin to see the process of how this works and how we can continue to narrow down and focus in on particular domains and subdomains and all of the helpful information we can gather. Again, no results. So let's actually take off our Google and let's try port 80 once again. And we'll let it search through all of those available search engines. And we're beginning to see some results. We're told that 45 unique subdomains were found. It's now scanning for open port 80 on those subdomains. And it looks like it did find some. Once we were able to use all of our available search tools instead of just Google, we do find some open ports. So you can see the difference there in narrowing that down and in broadening your search using different tool sets to search with. So certainly not a comprehensive list of things that you can use for domain and subdomain enumeration and footprinting, but these are definitely some of the most widely used resources out there. And again, they're going to begin to help you gather all kinds of helpful intel about a domain. Another great way that we can gather intelligence is through social networking. Almost everyone we know today has a social media presence of some sort, and that includes businesses. One of the main ways that threat actors actually deliver payloads onto a target is through social engineering. In other words, they may target a specific employee, perhaps a low-level employee that they believe may not be as tech-savvy, and maybe they can trick them into clicking on a phishing email, which would install some sort of malware on their local system and give them an entry point into the network and a larger target. There are several benefits to using social media for open source intelligence gathering, and some of that includes the fact that the data is usually relevant. Most people will put their actual correct data on there as far as contact information, especially on an outlet like LinkedIn, where they know employers may be looking at that. So the data is usually fairly reliable. Another benefit is that this is a large database. As I said, most people you know are probably a member of some social media platform, so there's a good chance you could find information on there. Also, as with other forms of open source intelligence, this is relatively low cost and low risk. As a matter of fact, it's not uncommon to see law enforcement agencies using social media. You see that in news reports all the time where they've tracked down suspects through their social media pages. So it tends to be correct and reliable. So let's talk about some of the ways that we can do that. Some of those are probably going to be very obvious to you, and they would include actually searching on a social media platform. You can see here in Facebook that I've just performed a search for Mark Zuckerberg. We can click on that and we can begin to see some of the information about them. We see where they live. We see where they went to school. All of these things can perhaps give us clues about passwords that they might have. In many cases, you can find birthdays and basic contact information on here as well. We can see family details. And that will be true for most all social media platforms. If we take a look at Twitter, we do a search for Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter. We can see some information about them on here as well. Many times in the bio information, you'll have ways to contact them. Maybe you'll see their personal website. So that's a good place to look. Likewise, LinkedIn. As I already said, this seems to be a place where people are most willing to put their personal contact information just for the sake of maybe finding employment or connecting with people. One of the helpful things in LinkedIn specifically is that you can search for companies on here and you can find employees of companies. So if we're trying to do something, as I mentioned earlier, where we're trying to tailor a social engineering attack and we're looking for employees of a specific company, this is a good way that we can find that and perhaps find some contact information to begin tailoring something like a phishing email attempt. So again, these are pretty obvious. We actually just go to the social media platforms and perform a people search against that. Now, additionally, we do have websites that are tailored specifically towards searching for people and gathering information about people. These, by the way, are paid services. One of those is Intellus.com. This is a common place where attackers may look for things like phone numbers, maybe someone's age or their address, their date of birth, previous work history, their relatives. Again, ways that they can potentially social engineer this person, or maybe clues into potential passwords that they might use. A similar one is PQ.com. You can see a listing here for Bill Gates and some of the information we see. It actually searches through social media platforms to find social media pages. We see their age. We can find phone numbers. We can find public records. Lots of information to be found there. And the last one I'll mention is BeenVerified.com. Again, common places that attackers would use to search for personal information that can be found on social media platforms or on the web at large. These types of services, again, they're paid, but they do perform a very thorough public record search. Now let's jump back into a terminal inside of our Parrot OS, and let's look at our tool again called the Harvester. So I'll enter that command and get that loaded. And we also have the ability to search social media using this tool. Let's say we want to search for employees of a particular company. One thing we can do here with the Harvester is we can search through specific social media platforms. Let's take a look once again at our help file so you can see the optional arguments that we have listed in here. And I'm going to arrow up and say the Harvester. I'm going to say -D to indicate the domain, and I'm going to say ecouncil.org. I'm going to say -L to once again limit the searches to 250, and I'm going to say -B to use the source LinkedIn. And I'm going to hit enter. We'll let that run. We'll see this indexing through our search results. And what's happening here is this is looking for any LinkedIn profiles that seem to be attached to the EC Council company. And now we see our output is completed. If we scroll up, we're going to see some of these results listed here. So this is a way that we can kind of enumerate a company on LinkedIn. We can see the names of some of the employees that work there along with their titles. Why would we want this? Well, an attacker would use that, as I said, as maybe a way to find lower level employees perhaps that may not be as tech savvy so that they could tailor social engineering attacks against those. It's also possible that they found some compromised credentials online. We know that usernames and passwords get leaked all the time, and those lists end up somewhere on the internet inevitably. So maybe they have a list of those, and they can cross-reference this list of employees known to be associated with EC Council against that list of compromised logins. So that could potentially give them a way to log in to one of these user accounts on some sort of platform, whether that's a corporate account or whether that's a personal account. Then they could use that information to try and pivot into their actual target. So again, just a few ways that we can use social networking for footprinting. There's lots of great information to be had using a simple social media site search and using tools like the Harvester inside of Parrot OS. Let's take a look now at email footprinting. Email is one of the most popular vectors for delivering malware, which can provide ways to open ports and create backdoors into a system that will allow an attacker to maintain access to a target system. So we'll look at a few popular tools here for email footprinting. And the first one I'll show you is here in my Parrot OS terminal, and that is called Email Harvester. We can run that command, and you'll see that it loads up this tool. You can point this tool to a specific domain, and then it will go out and search multiple search engines for any instances of email addresses that contain that domain. I'm going to arrow up and run the email harvester command, and some of the optional arguments that we've already looked at with previous tools are going to be valid here. Namely, we see the -D to indicate the domain. So I'm going to say Microsoft.com. I'm also going to use the -L argument to limit that to 250 searches. Now, in an actual pen test, we probably wouldn't want to do that, but I'm going to do that in this case just to save time in this lab example. And also to save time, I'm going to limit that to the Bing search engine. Again, in a regular pen test, we probably wouldn't want to limit that either, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to do that. Now, in this case, because I've limited that search so much, you'll see that there are no emails found. Again, I did that for the sake of brevity, but under normal circumstances, you would not want to limit that. So this would normally pull back a list of email addresses. It's going to scrape the web for any instances where we have a user using a Microsoft.com email address. Let's jump into a web browser now. And I also want to point out a web-based tool called hunter.io. This is something that you need to register for. You can register under the free plan to get a limited amount of results, but if you need more, you can obviously use a paid plan to get better results with that. So under here, let's say eccouncil.org, and you'll see that pops up. We'll do a quick search for that. And this also will return a list of email addresses attached to that domain. You can see that we have 62 results listed here at the top. We also have the option to export those in CSV format, separated values. We're told the most common pattern is first.last@eccouncil.org. And of course, under here, we're going to see lists of all the email addresses found. Now, we can actually expand these individually as well. If we take this second one in the list as an example, we'll see 20 different sources where this particular email address was found on the internet. This is from a marketing manager, so lots of these are press releases. As you can see, some of these are blogs from Digital Forensics Magazine as an example. So lots of great information to be had in this free web search tool. Again, that's just one of the options that are out there, but it is one of the most popular ones. Hunter.io is also something that we can use inside of our search tools like ReconNG as well. We can reference Hunter.io using those command line tools. Now, what would an attacker do with some discovered email addresses? First, as we've already mentioned, that can be used to maybe craft some sort of social engineering attack, particularly on people who maybe they assume aren't as tech savvy. If we went down through this list and maybe we found someone who was maybe not working in the technical side of things, perhaps that would be a better target than, let's say, someone working in information security. Most likely that would not be successful. Additionally, an attacker might reference the Have I Been Pwned website. On this website, you can actually pop in any email address and it will tell you if that email address is known to be contained in any sort of data breach. If we're able to find a valid email address against a domain which we're testing, and that is known to be found in a data breach, there's a good chance we may be able to find those compromised credentials somewhere online, if they haven't been changed. This particular website was created by the phenomenal Troy Hunt, who's a web security consultant. He does great work. So definitely check out this resource if you aren't familiar with that, and protect yourself as well. Check your own email address. So this simply references a list of email addresses known to be involved with security breaches. This site doesn't have any actual passwords stored anywhere on there. Now that begs the question, where would we find these types of databases? Well, there are many nefarious sites where you can find these hosted and even shared around cloud file sharing platforms such as Mega. Now, I'm not going to point you to any specific source for these just for liability reasons, but I just want you to know they're out there and they can be found. One final thing I want to look at is an email header. An email header contains all of the information around an email address. You're going to find details of the sender and receiver in there. You're going to find IP addressing, dates, authentication information, and more. You'll also sometimes see which email program was used to send an email if they're using a desktop client. So this is an example email header from an email I received, and I do have some things highlighted in red that I just wanted to point out to you. If you're able to receive an email from a domain against which you're trying to test, maybe examining the headers could give you some valuable information. So this particular header, you'll see a delivered to, that previously had my email address listed in there. You'll see information about when it was received, the date and time during which that was received. If we scroll down, you'll see listed here mx.google.com. That is the sender's mail server that they use. This particular email came from Zoom Communications, and this was a marketing email. So we see the Zoom IP address. This is the sender's IP address for whatever server they're using to send that. If we scroll on down a couple of other things, we see SHA-256 listed here, RSA. That is the authentication being used by the sender's email server. And of course, we see the full name and email address listed down here as well, among many other things. So email headers are a great way to get some detailed information about the system that's being used to send email by a particular target. And in addition to everything we've looked at here, we can also go back and use some of the previous tools that we've examined, like ReconNG and the Harvester. We've looked at gathering results from those tools already, and we've previously seen how those will also pull in email information. So just a few options here that I wanted to show you for performing email footprinting. Let's now talk about WHOIS and DNS footprinting. First of all, what are those two things? WHOIS is actually an internet record listing that identifies exactly who owns a domain and how you can get in touch with them. A WHOIS record will contain all of the contact information that's associated with a person or a company that's registered to a particular domain. So if we're able to perform a WHOIS lookup against a domain, we could potentially get some information that will allow us to contact someone inside of the company for a targeted attack. DNS stands for Domain Name System. That is a protocol that associates IP addresses with human-readable addresses. So for example, here in my terminal, if I ping google.com, you'll see that it's going to return an IP address of 142.251.33.206. So instead of going to google.com, if we didn't have DNS, we would actually have to remember these IP addresses and pop those into our browser. So obviously, DNS is a great technology, but DNS records, if we're footprinting, those can show us lots of things about a particular system. If we know a particular server name, but we don't know the IP address, then we can look that up. One of the ways we can do that is by using NSLookup. NSLookup is typically used to see whether or not DNS records are configured properly, but this will also return some helpful information to us. So here in my terminal, I've just entered NSLookup and I've hit enter. Now I can enter a particular domain. Let's say ecouncil.org, and I'll hit enter. And this is going to return some information for us. We see the server 8.8.8.8. Those are the well-known Google DNS servers that lots of people will use. And we see some IP addressing attached to this particular domain name. There are different types of DNS records, and we can view those here as well. If we say set type equals A and hit enter, this is going to show us the address record. Now I'm going to arrow up and again run that against ecouncil.org, and you'll see the non-authoritative answer here, ecouncil.org, followed by the IP address that we've already seen. We can also say set type equals MX. Those are going to be domain mail server records. So I'll again run that, and we see the non-authoritative answer for the mail exchanger, ecouncil-org.mail.protection.outlook.com. And we can continue to do that with all of our different types of DNS records, such as CNAME, the canonical name, or name servers as well. So that's a basic way that we can do that within our terminal, but let's also look at some website tools. The first one I'll point you to is website.informer.com. You can see that I've already popped my domain in there and I've performed a search for that. If I scroll down to the WHOIS section, you can see our domain name, the domain registration ID. Again, all of this is a matter of public record. We can see that this is registered to Network Solutions, who takes care of that for them. And we see lots more information in here as well. Registrant email addresses, all kinds of things. Now, in some cases, there is masking and hiding in play here. And what we're seeing here is not unusual in the fact that this particular website isn't registered to a specific person. But where this might come in handy is, again, if we're targeting maybe an internal employee for an attack, maybe for some sort of social engineering attack, maybe they have a personal website of their own, and maybe we could run a WHOIS record against that website, and it would return their personal information to us so that we would have more info to be able to tailor that attack. Another one is domain tools. You can find that at whois.domaintools.com. And again, I've already ran a search here, and we're seeing registrar information for network solutions. We see the name servers in use on this particular domain, which are through Cloudflare. We see the IP address location of these servers in Miami, Florida, here in the United States, and lots more information if we continue to scroll down and look through that. And finally, I'll point you to one last resource called DNSdumpster.com. Let's click search. And then let's click here on the DNS servers. This is going to give us detailed information about those DNS servers, including the names of the name servers. We see, again, the MX records. We see any TXT files that are in there. We see host records as well. And if we scroll down, we even see a map of the domain. We can click that to see a full-size image, and this just gives us a visual representation of exactly what's in place. So we see the domain with a DNS server going out to Cloudflare. We see the MX server here, and we see IP addresses associated with all of that information. Again, we also see some subdomains, as we've already looked at previously when we looked at footprinting subdomains. And as with all of the footprinting methodologies we've looked at previously, there are certainly paid tools here that will help extract even more information, including network service providers, administrators, IP addresses, and technical support information, all of which could be valuable intel when we're trying to gather that reconnaissance. Let's take a look now at network footprinting. And again, as we've been doing, we're going to start out in the terminal with a bit more of a basic look at that, and then we'll look at some website resources as well. So one of the first ones that might be obvious to you if we're performing network recon is the traceroute command. So here in the terminal, let's say traceroute, and we'll set that to google.com. We'll trace our route out to Google. So traceroute is going to return results for every single hop on the network that this traffic passes through in order to reach google.com. You'll see that by default, we can have a 30 hop maximum. That means that this traceroute traffic can potentially pass through 30 different devices before it's considered a failure. And so this is essentially mapping out the entire route from where I am currently inside my Parrot OS out to google.com. And each one of these lines is going to represent one of the hops that this has to take to get there. Now, why is this important? Well, it can help us to visualize any sort of internal hops that may be happening. And when I say internal hops, I mean just because we're going out to a domain, that doesn't mean that it goes directly to a single server. This could travel through multiple internal servers. The more internal servers that we know about, the more opportunities that we have to poke around and hopefully find a way to get inside there. So one thing that we can do, we can go ahead and start browsing through some of this information that's returned. This 10.0.2.2, that's my local IP address on my Parrot OS. 192.168.0.1, that is my first hop IP address. That, in other words, is my local router on my home network where this has to go to get out to the public internet. Then you'll see a Spectrum address listed here. I do have Spectrum Internet. You'll notice the Berea, Kentucky listed here. That is where I live. And we continue to see that travel through different Spectrum Internet routers and hops. We see multiple instances of that listed. And then eventually we start seeing just some IP addresses, which I suspect are attached to just Google's own servers. So let's verify some of this. Let's go ahead and let's first grab this top IP address here and let's copy that. And then let's jump out to a browser. The first place I'm going to show you in this browser is a place called ARIN, American Registry for Internet Numbers. This will let us search against a specific IP address to get information about that. So I'm going to pop in the address that I copied. I'm going to hit search and let's see what this tells us. So this tells us that this is a Charter Communications device. That means this is still some sort of Spectrum device. In fact, we see that this is legacy Time Warner Cable assets. If you know about Time Warner Cable and Spectrum, Spectrum actually bought out Time Warner Cable, so that does make complete sense. Let me jump back into my traceroute output once again, and let's copy the next IP address in our hop list. Let's pop that into our ARIN registry and see what we're told about that. We'll hit search, And that is the beginning of our Google servers. You'll see Google listed here. You'll see that the address is, of course, in California. So we can see the traffic traveling through my own local network out to the public internet and eventually over to Google. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how powerful and useful the traceroute command can be. And as an alternative to this, there's something called MTR, My Traceroute. That combines the functionality of commonly used traceroute and ping commands into a single tool. So in a very similar fashion, this is going to return an output in our terminal about hosts through which our traffic is traveling. Now, this is not something that you're likely to have already installed. So just so you know, to install that, you would say sudo apt install MTR, and that will get that all installed for you. It's a very small program, so it doesn't take long at all. Again, I already have that installed. So in order to run that, I can simply say MTR google.com. Now, when I hit enter, this is actually going to open an interactive terminal for me. And that's going to update, as you can see here, in a more visual manner. There's a list that's listed here. We can pause, we can restart, we can quit. If we don't want to see this visual output pop up, we can actually say mtr-r, and then we'll say google.com once again. And this is going to give us a more traditional looking output, and it's going to keep us here in our terminal. So we see our start message, and pretty soon we're going to see information about how many failures or successes we have, because remember, this is combining the traceroute with the ping command, and it's also going to continue to display all of the hops that we're taking to get out to that particular network. So we see the host name parrot listed here. We see my local IP address. We should see my first hop address next, and we do. We have 0% loss on both of those, as we would expect. And then we start seeing some Spectrum devices. So I'm going to go ahead and break out of this, because essentially we're going to see the exact same information. But I did want you to know about that handy little program, because it is very thorough and I enjoy the output of that. So that might be something that you prefer over the traditional traceroute. So let's break out of this, and let's go back and let's grab one of these original IP addresses from our list of hops here at the top from our initial traceroute. And I want to show you one more website resource, and that has to do with the geolocation of a particular IP address. So I'm going to paste that in here. I'm going to click look up, and this particular website is called ip2location.com. You can search for up to 50 IP addresses per day for free, or you can sign up for an account. I'll also mention that there are several services like this online. This just happened to be the first one that popped up in a quick Google search for me, but there's lots of different websites that do perform this service. So if we scroll down, again, this is a Google server, and you'll see that this is listed in California. The ISP is Google LLC. The domain is google.com. So all the information we would expect to see here from the geolocation and other information. So lots of great information gets returned here to us as well. One other thing I'll mention, if we go back to the Aaron website, is the ability to look for a network range. You'll see that we have a network range listed here. And in fact, let me go back to my terminal. And if I ping google.com, and I'll give that just a moment to resolve, that's going to return an IP address for the domain google.com. We see that listed here. Going to copy that. Going to go back to our Aaron website, and I'm going to paste that in and perform a search. And one thing that this provides for me is a network address range. It could be very handy to know the private IP address range that's been assigned to a particular target that we're interested in. This can be helpful if we're doing some more in-depth scans and we want to scan against an entire network range. We know the entire possibilities of where a particular company could have hosts or servers assigned. Now, we've been looking at this from the perspective of the outside, of course, looking at ways that we can footprint some of the network at large. And there are certainly more in-depth scans that we can do with tools such as Nmap to try to get some internal information. But again, remember, we're still in the footprinting and reconnaissance phase here. We're trying to discover information, preferably without directly interacting with a target. As we move through the scanning section in the future, we'll look at more active methods of engagement. So far, we've been looking at some actual tools and resources for footprinting, but we also want to talk about social engineering. Social engineering is the art of manipulating people into divulging confidential information, and these attacks take on many forms, with attackers attempting to obtain sensitive data such as passwords or financial information, or attempts to gain control of a system. These are largely successful due to the general trusting and non-confrontational human nature that many of us have. The majority of security incidents are caused by user error in some way, so it should not be a surprise to hear that humans are considered to be the weakest link in the security chain. With that said, let's discuss some common types of social engineering, beginning with phishing. Phishing is the fraudulent practice of sending emails while posing as a legitimate institution. Phishing emails usually contain a link to a malicious resource of some sort that is made to look legitimate, and they do that in an attempt to lure an individual into providing sensitive data, such as login credentials, banking information, and personally identifiable information. Spear phishing is a targeted phishing attack with the same goal as a normal phishing campaign. The difference is that rather than sending out mass emails to random users, this attack is limited in scope to specific individuals or groups within an organization. An attacker would use reconnaissance methods to try and increase the success rate of the attack. For example, they may try to obtain legitimate email addresses from an internal user. That would allow them to see how an organization formats their email addresses or their signature lines. That way they can craft a more realistic looking phishing email. Whaling is similar to spear phishing in that it uses targeted email campaigns. The difference is that this attack specifically targets high-profile employees, maybe what we call C-level employees, such as CEO, CFO, or CIO. The term whaling comes from the size of the catch. In other words, the corporate executives. It goes without saying that higher-level employees are likely to have more permissions and more access on a network. Farming is an attack where a website's traffic is manipulated in order to steal confidential information. This is typically done with the assistance of malware installed on a user's computer, which redirects web traffic to malicious imposter sites. This can also be done by poisoning a DNS server to affect multiple users or through tactics like SQL injection. The malicious website landing is used to collect personal or financial information. Some social engineering tactics are much less complex than using software and tools, and that includes things like eavesdropping. This can be in the form of actually eavesdropping on a conversation in an attempt to hear sensitive information, or maybe doing that in a digital manner through intercepting communications in some way. That could be oral communications, or that could be digital or written communications as well. Tailgating is a method for obtaining physical access, where an attacker follows an authorized person into a secure location. For example, if someone is trying to gain access into a secured, locked building, maybe a building that is protected with a key card, they might hang around the entrance until someone else enters. Again, the attacker is taking advantage of general human nature here and the fact that some people may hold the door for someone else to enter the building closely behind them. So they use this common courtesy to their advantage. Baiting happens when an attacker leaves an infected physical device in a public area in hopes that someone will use that out of curiosity. This is typically achieved with USB flash drives. Maybe someone would drop some of those in a parking lot, or they might leave them in an employee break room, somewhere that's more public. And the hardware would look and function normally, but commonly that might do something such as quietly installing malware in the background on the system that the device was connected into, unbeknownst to the victim. There's also shoulder surfing, which is nothing more than positioning yourself behind someone in an attempt to look over their shoulder, trying to discover information. That information could be displayed on the computer screen itself, or maybe someone is trying to discover login credentials by observing the physical keystrokes as they are entered. And there's dumpster diving. This is when an attacker would look through discarded items in hopes of finding copies of sensitive information, such as financial documents. Proper physical disposal methods should be in place in order to safeguard against this. This would include things like shredding paper copies of sensitive records and secure hard drive destruction and disposal. Another important consideration we want to discuss before we dive into some deeper actions is documentation. If you're going to be successful, then keeping notes and proper documentations is absolutely critical. It's going to save you tons of time in the long run, and it's going to help you to communicate your findings better to your customers. As we've mentioned, we want to present reports at the end of any of our assessments that we do, and the notes that we keep during those assessments are going to be helpful to insert into those reports. It's going to allow us to take screenshots and show examples, and also to be able to duplicate some of the things that we found because we've saved commands and saved examples of that. Now, there are many options for note keeping, but for me, the main requirement is that notes have the ability to be hierarchical. In other words, I should be able to make subsections or subfolders of the notes. I also want the ability to use what's called rich text format, or RTF. This file format allows us to copy and paste between lots of different applications. So for example, if you're familiar with the simple Notepad application in Windows, that does not allow for rich text formatting. WordPad, on the other hand, that does allow for that. The reason I want that is I want to have the ability to paste in maybe SQL commands or programming language code to keep the format in place. That allows me to easily copy and paste anywhere else that I want without the need to reformat that. It just saves time and it removes a lot of potential syntax errors. Now, as I said, the program you use is mostly personal preference. I used OneNote for a very long time. That does have a hierarchical structure. I can make notes with multiple subsections that are organized quite well. A tool that I'll show you here that I usually use if I'm using Kali Linux or Parrot OS is a tool called Cherry Tree. And although this is included in some newer builds of Kali Linux, it is not included by default in Parrot. So I'll show you the command to install that. You would say sudo apt install Cherry Tree. And if I hit enter, you'll see that I have no newly installed packages because I already have that in place. If I open my menu bar down at the bottom, and I do a search for Cherry Tree, you'll see that pops up here. So let's launch that, and I'll expand this into full screen. And I have an example note inside of here that we can take a look at. This is from a vulnerable demo website that's called Altoro Mutual, which is essentially a fake financial institution website. I'll point out we see some hierarchical structure here. I have a main note and I have a subsection here. In the main notes window, you'll see that I do have a website address listed for that. And under that, we have a SQL vulnerability subsection with some additional notes listed here. We have a successful SQL injection command saved. Now, don't get caught up too much in the details of that at the moment. For now, we're just looking at the usefulness of taking good notes. So from Cherry Tree, I could actually click one of these links, and that will load my browser. You'll see that it loads up my Firefox browser and takes me out to that website. So again, an example of why I like to use rich text formatting. I can then go back into my Cherry Tree note, and I'm just going to copy the SQL command that I've listed here for both the username and the password. I'll highlight that and give that a copy. And then I'll jump back into Firefox, and I'm going to paste this into both the username and password sections. I'm going to click Login, and you'll see that when I do that, I have a successful login to this website. If we jump back into Cherry Tree, you'll notice that I also have a screenshot inside of this note, so that's something else that we can do with Cherry Tree. We can add images inside of there, among other things. Let me minimize my Cherry Tree for the time being, and I'll minimize this browser. And I also want to talk about screenshotting and screen recording. These things are also super helpful. It will allow you to take a screen grab like I already showed you. You can also create a video recording so that you can see things in action in regard to what's happening during your testing. This is great if you want to demonstrate some of the things that you find. If you want to demonstrate a certain vulnerability, you can record that and then play that back to a customer during the post-assessment meeting. The application that I typically use is called Kazam. And again, that's something that is built into Kali Linux that is not built into Parrot OS. And again, I'll mention these aren't the only two options out there. These are just two that I got used to using inside of Kali Linux. So I moved those over to Parrot OS. We can install that by saying sudo apt install Kazam. That's K-A-Z-A-M. I'll hit enter, and once again, we see nothing newly installed because I already have that. So let's go to our menu, and we'll do a quick search for Kazam. You'll see that pops up. And a couple of options that we have. We have the screencast option, which is going to record an actual video. You'll see the options of full screen. We can do that in a specific window, maybe a web browser window, or we can choose manually an area that we want to capture as well. You'll see we also have the option of, by default, it's going to include the mouse cursor. We can also capture sounds if we'd like to do that, and the number of seconds before the capture begins. I'm going to click the capture button just to give you a look at what that looks like. You'll see the 5-second countdown that I've left in there by default. So it's currently recording the screen. You'll notice in the upper right corner, we have the Kazam recording icon. If we click that, we can either pause the recording or we can finish the recording. Once we finish that, we can actually go out to our videos directory and we see my screencast captured in here. So that's my video file that I just recorded. Let me close this and let's look at the screenshot option as well. You'll see that similarly, we can do full screen, windowed, or a particular area. If I click the capture button, again, we're going to have the countdown listed here. We can take that off if we'd like to. And that actually took a full screen screenshot. We can also do that with an area. With an area, we don't have a countdown. We're actually told to select an area by clicking and dragging. So let's do that. You'll see that when I click and drag, we have a boundary box. And when I stop holding down my mouse button, it releases that. Now we can either press enter to confirm this selection, or we can hit escape to start over and select a new area. I'm going to hit escape. Let's go back to our places. And in my home folder, that's where we're going to see the screenshot. That's the default location where those are saved to. Now you can change where these default locations are, by the way. If we go to File and Preferences, under Screencast, we can choose a different directory if we'd like. And under Screenshots, we can also choose a different directory. So just a couple of options there that you can use. Now, if we go back into our cherry tree instance, we have a button here on our toolbar to insert an image, and we can select our Kazam screenshot and click open. This is going to allow us to choose a size, a width and height for that. I'm going to make it just a bit smaller. I'll hit OK, and you can see that does get pasted in there. That's the full screen image that we captured. So that's just one option for note keeping, for screenshotting and screencasting. And again, there are lots of options out there depending on what you like and what you're used to. There's no right or wrong answer here. Keep Note is another popular option. OneNote that I mentioned, that's popular. If you're running Kali Linux, there are other options built into that as well. If you're running this as a virtual machine, maybe from a Windows-based machine or a Mac-based machine, then Windows and Mac also have lots of other screenshotting and note-keeping options depending on the underlying operating system. But I did want to show you a couple of the things that I personally use, how to get those installed, and how to keep notes, take screenshots, and screencasts. I'll also mention that you don't have to keep notes inside of Kali Linux or Parrot OS themselves, especially if you're running this as a virtual machine. And in fact, it's probably a good idea not to. You probably don't want to keep your notes on the virtual machine that you're using as a test device. But just realize that you do have various options here. The most important thing is that you are performing good documentation. You want to make sure you're keeping good notes and that everything is documented in a way that makes sense to you so that it's organized for presentation at a later time. Now that we've looked at several footprinting measures, we want to talk here about some countermeasures. We want to know how we can protect against the things that we've been examining. And first and foremost, let's start looking at network information. The entire reason that we went through all of these footprinting techniques is because it's the number one way that we can discover what's actually out there. So we want to use footprinting techniques against our own organization or network in order to see what is visible from the outside. And then we want to use those results to begin removing anything that we can so that we're not susceptible to footprinting. Also, we want to opt for domain privacy services. You can opt for privacy in the Whois lookup database, so essentially all of your sensitive contact information will be hidden. So when someone performs a Whois lookup, as we looked at previously in this course, they wouldn't get your sensitive private information. So that's a good practice as well. Also, DNS security options. That would include splitting your internal and your external DNS from one another, and also restricting what's called a zone transfer. DNS zone transfers allow us to make an entire copy of the DNS database to another server. And that's commonly done when we may have a backup DNS server that we want to make sure is mirroring what our main server is. You want to be sure you're restricting those zone transfers only to allowed and approved servers that are under your control. That's going to prevent attackers from making a direct copy of your DNS records. Next, let's talk about system information. Of course, we want to shut down any unused ports and services. So for example, if you discover there's a telnet port open, telnet is an unsecured protocol, something that we don't want to use, so that's something you would want to shut down. Also, any unused services as well, particularly those services that may be no longer supported, that are not getting updated, which would be susceptible to vulnerabilities. We also want to disable geotagging functionality. If you think of that in terms of a photograph, geotagging by default in many cases is turned on when we take a photo with something like a mobile device. So if you have photos on your website or on a web server that are geotagged, someone is able to download those images. They can essentially figure out your exact location. It's a best practice to hide that type of information, so that's something that you would want to consider as well. Also, proper web server configuration. That would include things like making sure you have strong login credential requirements, making sure that only a certain set of authorized users have login credentials on that, and making sure that you remove any users who no longer need access, such as ex-employees. Also, if you're using something like a SQL database, you would certainly want to make sure that you don't have any SQL injection vulnerabilities as well. Next, we have organization information. One of the top things on this list is employee education. As we looked at in our email harvesting section, we found many instances where employee emails were used on open forums, and those are easily searchable as public record. You want to educate and encourage your employees to use things like pseudonyms or other names that aren't their real information that can be tied back to the organization. This can help prevent them from becoming a social engineering target. Also, keeping critical information offline. That would include any sensitive information about your organization, such as year-end reports or even press releases that may contain critical information, especially things that are only internal documents made for internal employees. Along those lines, you don't want to keep any sensitive information that's anywhere visible, maybe in a break room, that someone could snap a photo of and end up online. We also want to restrict network access to social networking. Social networking is one of the main vectors for social engineering, so it's a best practice to disallow any access to that from the corporate network. Anytime an employee is attached to our corporate network, whether that's wired or wireless, it's really not a good idea to give them the ability to have those social networking contacts. The caveat, of course, would be someone who maybe works in PR or marketing. And some general best practices would include encryption and protection of sensitive assets. When we talk about encryption, you might typically think of that with data in motion. In other words, data being transferred over an encrypted VPN tunnel. But that also applies to data that is at rest, or in other words, any data that's stored locally on our servers or in the cloud. We want to make sure that's properly encrypted and protected through strong passwords. Speaking of passwords, we want to have strong password policies as well. We want to make sure that any employees who are accessing our assets, accessing the network, accessing corporate email, we want to make sure that password policies are strong enough to make those resistant to things like brute force attacks. Enforcing general security policies is also important. This includes the umbrella security policies for the entire organization. An example of this would be good BYOD policies. BYOD meaning bring your own device. It's very common these days for users to bring their own mobile devices or laptops and attach to the corporate network. So we want to make sure that we've properly secured that to prevent any data from being leaked through those vectors. And of course, as we've already mentioned previously, employee education is an important consideration here as a best practice. We want to make sure we are educating our employees about some of the things that we've talked about, particularly social engineering attacks. We want to make sure that we have ongoing training to help them identify what an attempt to take advantage of them might look like. And again, lots of those things we talked about in the social engineering lesson. We want to make sure they're very careful about letting anyone into restricted areas that doesn't have proper access, or a key card or whatever that protection looks like. We want to make them aware of shoulder surfing. We want to make them aware of phishing emails and what those might look like, and make sure that they're just generally security minded. There are certainly other things that can help prevent footprinting that might be critical for you depending on what sector you work in or what your business looks like. But these are some of the general places that we would definitely want to start with when we're trying to prevent footprinting.